All right, good evening. I'm going to talk about the Paris Peace Conference, first section in the study guide for test 2. So let's get this application going. Now, when we left off, we reached November the 11th, 1918, the Armistice for World War I. And again, an armistice was simply an agreement by both sides to stop shooting at each other. This should not be seen as a surrender by Germany. It was not taken by the Germans to mean that they were surrendering. There was simply, again, an agreement to stop shooting at each other while attempting to find a negotiated peace agreement. Okay. And this is going to be very difficult to do for reasons that we're going to see here pretty quickly. France, the peace talks will be held at the Versailles Palace outside of Paris. So this is why this is referred to as the Treaty of Versailles. France came to Versailles for revenge. France very much wanted Germany to never be able to do this again. Two million French were dead. That includes both civilians and military population. Much of the eastern France, where the war had been fought, was torn up. 750,000 houses, 23,000 factories. Had the French gotten what they wanted, Germany would have ceased to exist at the end of World War I. But the French definitely wanted Germany to be weakened militarily, politically, and economically, as close as they could get to France never existing. I mean, as close as they could get to driving Germany completely out of existence. British aims. Britain had also suffered. Certainly a number of British civilians, a number of British military had died. Not so much the civilian population. The war itself, with the exception of the attacks by the German submarines, had really not touched the civilian population. Britain's economy was in a precarious position. That's something we'll talk about more when we work our way up to the Great Depression. And thus the British were looking for a tempered revenge. They certainly wanted a weakened German military, but they weren't too keen on weakening Germany's economy for two reasons. The British delegation, led by their Prime Minister David Lloyd George, was worried that a bitter Germany could be a problem in the future. Turns out to be quite right about that. And the British wanted to resume their beneficial trade relationship with Germany. Germany and Britain, for all of their conflict after Germany's creation in the 1870s, did have a mutually beneficial trade relationship. And the British, under Lloyd George, were wanting to resume that relationship. And so while they wanted Germany's military to be weakened, they did not necessarily want Germany to be economically or politically weakened the way that the French wanted. The Americans, led by the President Woodrow Wilson, came to Paris preaching the 14 points. Now, we're not going to go through all 14 points, but there are some that are important. And then the secret treaties that had caused the alliance system to kick in back in 1914. What we would now call free trade between nations without tariffs or economic barriers. The right of self-determination for all peoples. This meant, as far as Woodrow Wilson was concerned, that Britain and France would have to give up their empires, their colonial empires. Wilson felt that the battle for colonies between Britain and Germany had been one of the causes of the war, and thus the European powers, Britain, France, Italy, what empire Italy had, Belgium, which had a significant empire, that those empires should be broken up, and that the people living in those empires should be allowed to choose their own destiny. There's some stuff in here about Russia and Belgium. There's a lot of stuff in here about breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, breaking up the Turkish Empire, reestablishment of Poland, okay, things that will play a role later. And important to Wilson was the establishment of the League of Nations. The League of Nations would hopefully prevent wars from breaking out by giving nations a place to hash out their disagreements with each other. Essentially, the League of Nations being the forerunner of today's United Nations. So the Americans were not really focused on revenge. What they were focused on was sort of destroying the problems that had caused World War I, the secret treaties, the trade barriers, the empire building, and the fact that there was no way to have a sort of a cooling off and talking it over period, which is what the League of Nations would hopefully be able to provide. What's going to happen, though, is that in order for Woodrow Wilson to get the League of Nations, he's going to pretty much sell out most of the rest of the 14 points. And what makes this even sadder is that the United States will never actually join the League of Nations. A story we'll get to. Woodrow Wilson spent 6 months in Paris. from typing today, January, through June of 1919 is when the peace talks were were ongoing. He found it difficult to get along with the French or the British. He found the French to be almost impossible to get along with. He found the French greedy, the Italians unhelpful, and the British completely unreasonable. Again, he's going to sort of trade in most of the other 13 points to get the League of Nations. And so a lot of the stuff, particularly about self-determination for all peoples, is going to go by the wayside. And that's one of the things to keep in mind about Versailles. Everybody was there. Mao Zedong was there, who would later be the leader of China after China's communist revolution. He was at Paris trying to get China free from its colonial masters. Ho Chi Minh was there trying to get Vietnam free from the French. There were Arabs from various different tribes taking their large Bedouin tents to Paris and camping out in them. So a lot of different representatives from all over the world, from the British, French, Dutch, Belgium, and even American empires were in Paris. The only people not in Paris were the Russians. And so again, there's 6 months of this very, very worldwide meeting to try to straighten out the post-war world. But most of the decisions are made by the Americans, the French, and the British. So what are we left with when we actually look at the Treaty of Versailles? Well, Germany lost about 13% of its territory. As you can see here, Germany lost significant chunks of territory to reestablish Poland over here. And then Alsace-Lorraine went to the French, and there were a few other odds and ends of Germany that were carved out and handed off to other powers. But of that 13% that Germany lost, about 50% of it was its steel industry that was lost in the war. Germany also lost all of its colonies overseas, most of which had been in Africa, but those are all taken away. Germany, in terms of its military, could have no air force. Good God, I cannot type today. No air force. No manufacturing of weapons. No importing weapons. No tanks. No submarines. And I'm not going to get into the specific numbers here, but a very limited navy, and that's on top of no submarines. And in total, Germany could only have 100,000 troops in its armed forces. And again, Germany had had 9 million troops at the beginning of World War I. In addition to this, there is Article 231 was called the War Guilt Clause. Germany accepts all responsibility for starting the war, conveniently forgetting Austria-Hungary's role in it and Serbia's. And Article 227 which labeled Germany's former monarch a war criminal. Now, because of Article 231, let me start a new slide here. Because Germany started the war, the Germans would have to pay reparations. The sum total about 5 billion British pounds, which, if we put it in roughly today's dollars, we're talking about $32 billion in reparations that the Germans were going to have to pay. Some of this would be literally in payment money. Some of it would be in industry, orders of steel, orders of coal, things like that. Agricultural products, forestry products, things like that. Now, here's how this treaty went down. The Germans were not invited to negotiate at Versailles. There is no German delegation that ever is involved in negotiations. Basically, the treaty is written up and given to the Germans to sign. The German delegation is simply brought into a room and they are handed a copy of the treaty and told that they have a week to sign it. Reaction in Germany was one of great anger, betrayal. The Germans had agreed to negotiate to the 14 points, not to having their empire broken up, being saddled with billions of dollars in payments, and losing 13% of their nation. Again, as far as the Germans were concerned, they had not surrendered on November the 11th. November the 11th was a ceasefire designed to begin negotiations for a settlement. The German government refused to sign the treaty. And in fact, the German Navy began to sink its own ships rather than hand them over to the French. Britain and France reacted to this by telling the Germans that they had 24 hours to sign the treaty or the war would begin again. The chief of the German army informed the government that the German army could not defend Germany against any further attack. And so with only 4 hours left to go, on June the 28th, 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, which is exactly 5 years to the day that Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. The treaty was never popular. Certainly, the military was not happy about the treaty. Conservatives were not happy. Many politicians were not happy. And so a rumor a myth began to grow up in Germany that Germany had been stabbed in the back by its politicians. Okay. What became known as the November criminals, the people who had stabbed Germany in the back. And many of these November criminals are going to, and politicians, Judaism and Jews are going to get a lot of that blame. The fact remains that in 1918, during the last year of the war, there had been labor strikes in German there have been labor strikes in German military production, strikes led by communists and socialists, many, not all, of whom were Jewish. And so this is going to allow German myth makers, like the Nazis, to create an enemy out of politicians, the communists, labor, socialists, Jews, and everyone else. This is a painting done by Otto Dix. It is called Berlin 1920. Juden raus, right here, means Jews out. So as early as 1920, when Hitler was still in the army and was a nobody, the feeling was already pervasive that Jews were responsible for Germany's defeat in the war. And that feeling is going to grow amongst the German military, amongst German conservatives, and certainly among the political factions on the right. And so we will look at how that myth of the November criminals will allow Hitler to make headway in German politics. While the League of Nations was created by the Treaty of Versailles, the United States never joined. Hyphenated Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, French Americans, etc., found reasons to hate the Treaty of Versailles. Communists hated it because Russia was not involved. And American soldiers returning from Europe began to wonder if the effort had been worth their while. The main problem with the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, as far as the United States Senate was concerned, was that it would place limits on America's military response. And that was something that conservatives in the Senate were simply not going to allow. Woodrow Wilson attempted, when it became apparent that the U.S. Senate was not going to accept the Treaty of Versailles and thus keep the United States out of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson went on a speech tour which further sapped his health. It's possible he had already suffered a stroke or possibly two strokes in Paris during the peace talks. But in October of 1919, he suffered a massive stroke in Washington, D.C., and was essentially incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. It would not be until October of 1921 that the United States would officially sign a peace treaty with Germany. All right, that concludes our look at the Paris Peace Conference. We will see how what happened at the Peace Conference helps to lay the groundwork for many things that are going to happen in the 1920s and 30s as we start heading towards the Second World War. Alrighty, I will see you in lecture number 2, where we will look at the first communist scare in the United States and also look at the quote-unquote race riots of 1919 and 1920.